So hello again, and welcome to the Faraday Institute. My name is Hugh Rollinson. I'm the course director here at the Faraday, and it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker this morning, Professor Simon ConwayMorris. Simon has held the chair in evolutionary paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge, and is a fellow of the Royal Society. Now, the title of the talk that we gave him was, Does the Evolutionary Narrative Tend to Support Theism? But I think Simon has slightly modified the title, and I'll leave him to introduce his talk. So Simon, without further ado, I hand over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Hugh, very much indeed. And as Hugh said to anybody in this country, good morning, but wherever else you might be, good afternoon, good evening, or possibly even good night. But in any case, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you briefly today. The exact title of my talk, in a certain sense, doesn't matter too much because it's all to do with how evolution may or may not be consistent with aspects of theism. And we could unpack this in many different ways. But very briefly, it's a matter of common observation that the majority of evolutionary biologists, I think it would be fair to say, are agnostic. That is, they have no determined faith. They are open-minded about these matters. A number are actually atheists, and in certain examples are very vociferous atheists, and we're familiar with their writings, which are often of a very high standard. But there are other people who profess one faith or another. I, as it happens, profess Christianity, but I have Muslim friends who are also evolutionary biologists, and I don't doubt there are Buddhists who are also evolutionary biologists, and I hope very much there's the Society of Shinto biologists, at least I very much hope there are. So there's no cut and dried aspects about connections between evolution and the faith which one might hold or might not. But on the other hand, why are so many evolutionary biologists agnostics? Well, one could unpack this in a number of different ways. They're certainly very intelligent people. In no case are they lacking a brain or anything like that. And I think one aspect goes back to the time of Darwin and also his great supporter, Thomas Henry Huxley. Because if you look at the immensity of evolutionary time and what we call the tree of life, that is from that primordial cell, perhaps 3.5 billion years ago, life has diversified into many major groups, and I've been lucky enough to work principally on the early origin of animals, as it happens. But then you follow the various ramifications of the tree of life, and there right at the end is one tiny twig, which is labeled humans. So from that perspective, we are just one small twig on this enormous tree of life. How could we possibly be of any significance? And one can draw an analogy, if you like, between what's referred to as Copernican mediocrity. That is that, we're just one small planet in a fair-sized galaxy in an enormous universe. So how could we in any way be special? And one might find the similar equation of Darwinian mediocrity. After all, we are just one species amongst not only the vast majority which are extinct, but the ones around us which show this colossal diversity. We're closely related, of course, to the great apes, but we are less closely related to the plants and so on and so forth. So I think that's part of the aspect that surely humans are just another evolutionary accident. Well, in point of fact, one can step back from that slightly and say, to begin with, it's fairly clear now that evolution is by no means completely unconstrained. Part of that, of course, is to do with the underlying physics and chemistry. If you live on a planetary surface and have an atmosphere of a certain composition and gravity of a certain strength and so forth, that necessarily, along with all the biochemistry and the behavior of the periodic table, will determine to a very specific set of contexts what might be possible. And certainly at the level of biochemistry, one sees, for instance, the remarkable properties of the element phosphorus, which of course is essential as a sort of energy carrier within the cell. And beyond that, there is a phenomenon known as evolutionary convergence, which I've got a considerable interest in. And this was something which is entirely familiar to all evolutionary biologists, including Darwin. And the point about evolutionary convergence, briefly, is that the number of possible so-called solutions is relatively small. In fact, it's infinitesimally small in as much as the number of all possible biological combinations is humongously large. Humongous, that's an English word, which means staggeringly big. And one thinks, for instance, of the number of elementary particles in the universe. I think it's around about 10 to the 90. It's a very, very big number. Maybe it's 10 to the 95. Somebody will probably correct me. But if you look at the number of possible biological combinations, it's orders and orders of magnitude beyond that. And yet here, at least on this planet, we find a recurrent return to particular solutions. Now, there's no rocket science about this. But then if we step back and say, well, all things being equal, how likely is it that something like a human would evolve over a given period of time? And evolutionary convergence suggests at a number of levels that something like a human is very much on the cards. And I'll just give you 3 examples of the sorts of things which strike me as examples of evolutionary convergence, which underpin the limited number of solutions. So I'm looking at my Zoom screen at the moment. I have my spectacles on or off. As the case might, if I take them off, I can't see a thing, of course. That's the nice thing about being a scientist. Oh, no, never mind. And the point here is that I am using a pair of so-called camera eyes. These are eyes which have a lens suspended between 2 chambers. Now, this so-called camera-like eye is also found in a number of other groups, including the octopus and the squid. And they belong to a group called the mollusks, which in turn are quite closely related to the earthworm, as it happens. And we, as it happens, generally are quite closely related to starfish. So it's very clear that the camera-like eye in the octopus and the squid has evolved pretty well independently of ourselves. It's an example of convergent evolution. And if I had more time, I could explain in excruciating detail just how similar they are, but crucially, the differences which are also there, because each one has a separate evolutionary trajectory, are actually in the end overcome by very clever examples of bioengineering. The point being that we have a common ancestor, that is ourselves and octopus, back in the Cambrian about 500 million years ago. And that animal, probably looked like a slug, probably had a sort of eye, but it did not have a complex camera eye. So here I am using a convergent eye. 2 other examples very briefly. There's some reason to think that advanced intelligence, amongst other things, will require what we call homeostasis. In other words, the body temperatures must be closely regulated. You can't just go through extreme fluctuations in the way, crudely, that reptiles often do. And it turns out that the warm-bloodedness which we employ, which ironically from a Darwinian perspective actually is a sort of failure, because in point of fact, you generate the heat because the transmission or the movement of the protons is actually inefficient, and that generates the heat. But it turns out that the warm-bloodedness in the birds has evolved independently of the warm-bloodedness in us. And the molecular mechanisms are extremely similar, but we can show that they're actually different. And of course, birds come from theropod dinosaurs, and we come from another group of dinosaurs, another group of reptiles further back in the late Paleozoic, about 350 million years ago. And then there is the example of brain size. Now, brains themselves are probably convergent, but increase in brain size, which in some part, and I'll come back to this in a moment, underpins what makes us human. Very large brains, in other words, species which show what we call encephalization. It's relatively uncommon, and that's not at all surprising because maintaining a brain is fantastically expensive metabolically. I had a delicious breakfast of fruit and nuts and all the good things you should eat. And round about 25% of that energy from that breakfast is powering my brain, which only accounts about 2% of my body mass. So brains require a huge amount of investment, and you could argue whether, in fact, they're always worth the effort, but the fact that independently, convergently, for instance, in the parrots and the crows, we have this striking increase in brain size relative to other creatures. By the way, and I'll come back to this in a moment, this is not for a moment to say that animals with smaller brains are in some sense disadvantaged or stupid. That's not an argument I think is appropriate. What one's trying to point out is that typically speaking, species are adapted for their local niche. And of course, as I'll come to explain in a moment, that doesn't seem to apply to ourselves. So that aspect of evolutionary convergence, the likelihood that something like a human will evolve has two immediate implications. First, unfortunately, there's no time to talk about it this morning, is that in principle, this means that something like humans should evolve on Earth-like planets wherever you are in the universe. In other words, there should be extraterrestrials, which the first approximation, not precisely, but the first approximation, are really very similar to ourselves. Unfortunately, of this morning, there's no evidence for extraterrestrials at all. And although it would be wonderful to have even more time to say that actually, paradoxically, this observation feeds into what I'm going to try and persuade you about generally. That is, that the world around us is very much more peculiar than you might at first sight expect, certainly from a materialist viewpoint. Indeed, those of my colleagues who are agnostics in this particular regard. But that said, there's a curious absence, apparently, of extraterrestrials, at least evidence for them. And this is known as the Fermi paradox. And the other aspect, of course, about human intelligence in particular is that despite us being a product of evolution, despite all the convergences which we see between ourselves and other animals, and in fact, some of those convergences extend much more widely. So to return very briefly to the example of warm-bloodedness, I could extend that principle to plants, because some plants generate heat, and they do this for very particular reasons, which again are very wonderful stories to tell. For instance, they can increase the temperature of the pollination chamber, so that the pollinators, often beetles, are warmed up and are more active and more effective in the process of pollination. So isn't it fun to talk about all these different sort of things? But when we start to look at humans who are clearly a product of evolution, diverging from something fairly similar to a chimpanzee, probably about 6 or 7 million years ago, we are completely different. Here I am talking about something called evolution. No other animal, so far as I know, has got the least interest in evolution. No other animal knows that it's evolved. And I can imagine some skeptics, those of you who have not fallen asleep yet, to say, well, come, you know, we don't expect animals to do these sorts of things. But in point of fact, I will try and persuade you, echoing work by such people as Thomas Suddendorf, who wrote a very interesting book called The Gap. And if you talk to animal behaviorists, especially those who are working on the great apes and on the crows and the parrots, is in unguarded moments, they will say, what exactly is it which makes us so utterly different from the animals? Clearly we are animals in so many respects, but what is about this sort of gap? And you'll see immediately, of course, that we have this tension between the Darwinian explanation, which I fully subscribe to, do not misunderstand me, in as much as we are part of a genealogy. And although the fossil record of the chimpanzees is very, very poor indeed, almost non-existent, the fossil record of the so-called homonyms going back best part of, well, it depends where you want to start, but you can go back to Sahelanthropus or Orrorin, or you can bring aboard Ardipithecus or Australopithecus or Homo erectus, doesn't really matter too much. That set of lineages, actually it's a set of diversifications within the hominid lineage in the last 5 million years, is actually fairly well documented. We have a good fossil record, and we can see things like changes in the ability to become bipedal, the increase in brain size, the use of tools, I'll come back to that in just a moment, and all the rest of it. And so here we have this obvious genealogical continuity between ourselves and the rest of the tree of life. And yet, we, in various ways, are remarkably different. Now, it would be very sensible and may well be the correct explanation that maybe there's some genetic mutations. After all, people constantly emphasize the degree of similarity genetically between ourselves and chimpanzees, and that is correct. But in point of fact, there are many highly significant differences, and if they weren't there, of course, we wouldn't be human. Whether those genetic differences actually translate into what makes us an articulate species is a slightly different question. But even so, that's one explanation. Other people have drawn attention, Robin Dunbar in particular, to the size of the social groups. And of course, we have this trend of increasing brain size, and one cannot doubt that there's some link between a large brain, in as much as very approximately our brains are about 7 times larger than you would expect in a mammal of our mass. So they're clearly, as I already emphasized, metabolically extremely expensive, but on the other hand, they enable us to do all these remarkable things. But that said, I don't, as it happens, find these explanations by themselves necessary and sufficient. And it seems to me that just as my agnostic friends who are biologists subscribe to a metaphysics, although they may not always realize that, so too one has to decide what is the nature of the metaphysics. That is, what is the nature of the world at large? What is the ontology of the world? And what is it? What is the matter of being? And how do we understand it through what's usually referred to as the epistemology of these things? I'm not a philosopher of science, so even you'll have noticed even the way I pronounce those words clearly shows me to be a rank amateur. There we go. And if I now very briefly go through the sorts of things which distinguish us from animals, this is not in any sense meant to be destructive. And even more emphatically, it is not trying to demote animals. It's not trying to say that because they don't show the features we see in humans, we therefore are allowed to treat them in particular ways. That would never be my argument. And Darwin himself was very sort of nervous about the question of vivisection and animal experimentation. And we know that this is something which, you know, has very deep resonances with people, because not for a moment do I doubt that animals are sentient, and not do I doubt that they have emotions and all these sorts of things. I think that's pretty clear. But despite all that, there seems to be something there which they never quite get. And it, in the end, revolves around language. But before I go there, let me just give you a few examples of the sorts of things which give me pause for thought. One of the advantages of looking at evolutionary convergence is that one can find parallel examples. And if the same thing keeps on cropping up, then that gives you more confidence that the thing you're studying is, if you like, reflecting a general property of biology. It's not a one-off. So we turn to the crows in particular, which are famously intelligent. And I will refer very briefly in a moment to the tool-making abilities of some crows. But this is a set of experiments which are being undertaken in various laboratories over the last 10 or so years. And they revolve around the analogy to Aesop's fable, whereby the thirsty crow, seeing a pitcher full of water, although the water in the pitcher is too low for the crow to drink, the crow then drops stones into the pitcher, thereby, in a way which Archimedes would understand, raising the level of the water so that ultimately the crow can obtain a drink. That's fine. Okay. And who knows, perhaps this fable, as so often is the case, is actually based on an original observation. But we can do similar things in a laboratory where we have a test tube full of water and some food floating tantalizingly out of reach. And you can train the crow. And that's a rather important point, training. And quite quickly, the crow will understand that by dropping stones into the test tube, then the level of the water is elevated and it gets its chow, it gets its reward. However, if you start to be a scientist and then start monkeying around with the tube, for instance, you might make a U-shaped configuration, or you might have various other sorts of configuration whereby only some of the tubes are connected to each other and the concealed bits are beneath the platform where the crow is strutting around, then it turns out, in point of fact, although the crows are intelligent, though they can learn and they will memorize, what they can't do is join the dots. They do not appear to understand cause and effect, the thing which, of course, drives science, basically. And that in its own way is quite surprising. Again, it's not that these animals are stupid. And you might well point out that in the natural world, they have no need to do this. Again, it's not for a moment to doubt their capacity for memory, and examples which a number of scientists have shown their ability to remember places where they've hidden the food for the winter and all the rest of it. It can be absolutely astonishing. But with these particular experiments, again, suggest that at a rather deep level, they are fundamentally not rational. And those sorts of examples of the Aesop fable and the training then lead me to a second observation, which is as follows. Inasmuch natural enough, whether we're looking at chimpanzees or dogs or whatever your example might be, or parrots or crows, you can't just chat to them and say, by the way, Frank, would you mind doing this? Because, of course, if you train them to understand your gestures, dogs in particular are absolutely phenomenal in that regard. But what you see again and again in the literature on animal behavior, in the fine print, is the amount of effort you need to train these animals is often absolutely staggering. And again, that's not necessarily surprising. But one of my favorite examples is to do with Rhesus monkeys. And we are interested in a thing called entrainment. And I'm hopeless at dancing by definition, whereby if you have a metronome and you change the pitch of the metronome, so it's going tick tock, like that, and they go tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Can the Rhesus monkey get the rhythm on this? And entrainment's very important, in fact, because it ultimately relates to being able to imitate somebody else, be able to see what they're doing and follow their gestures. So it's a rather subtle experiment. And I guess the net result of this particular set of experiments was after a year, a solid year of constant training, the Rhesus monkeys still couldn't get it. And this is not a complaint against the Rhesus monkey. It's an observation about us. I mean, what other species would spend a year trying to train a Rhesus monkey? It tells us an enormous amount about us. It doesn't tell us that much about the Rhesus monkey. And correspondingly, I came across a paper fairly recently to do with training starlings to do something or other, and it was something like 50,000 trials. And even then, in the fine print, you'll find that actually the success rate sometimes is only 70 or 80%. Again, this is not a complaint, but you compare it with our children who have this fantastic thirst for knowledge. Of course, they spend a few years getting up to speed, although the evidence increasingly suggests that their ability to comprehend things in the ways which I've already outlined are very, very early in their development. So it's not that the child is born as a blank slate, obviously not, but that aspect of, how difficult it is for them to train. Now, I mentioned the crows in the context of the New Caledonian crow, or rather the crows, and specifically tool making in animals. Yes, they use tools, absolutely. And we have the famous examples in the chimpanzees of the termite dipping and the ant dipping. In the New Caledonian crows, convergently, they make these probes which they push into rotten wood to extract the beetle grubs, which are very nutritious and are important for maintaining a large brain and all the rest of it. But the point about this is that effectively no animal ever uses one tool to make another tool, which means, I think, and as has been pointed out, that they will forever be denied a cumulative technology. They will not be able to build on what one tool can use to make another tool and so forth. Again, this is not a criticism, because of course, in fact, there are very many intelligent species which never use tools. And there's some other species which are not super bright, like the Darwin finches, which do use tools on occasion. So there's not a simple equation across these sorts of things. But even so, our difference, I think, which is being put forward by a number of people, is that, again, what we call a tool is not really a tool at all. It is a cognitive extension of ourselves. It is part of us. It is something where we project our mind into an inanimate object, which then feeds back into ourselves, not only by a process of constant refinement, which often leads to a near perfect object, but also leads to feedbacks in the development of the brain. And we know this, of course, in people who specialize in different sorts of sports and things like that. Our brains are extraordinarily plastic in their way that they can be remolded for particular functions. And I think, again, this is an example of the gap. Of course, animals use tools, but they simply don't see the tool the same way as we do. I was being pointed out, I forget the investigator, I'm afraid, but the suggestion was that a chimpanzee may well have a branch in the hand, and it might use that branch to obtain some bananas. but it doesn't associate that branch with a tree outside the compound. They don't link those sorts of things. And there too, of course, the problem is that we can't really ask the animals what they're thinking. We can only observe them. But effectively, it is likely, I think, that animals simply do not engage in what we call analogical thinking. They do not engage in metaphors. They do not engage in a sense, thinking outside the box. And this sort of segues into an extremely controversial area. And undoubtedly, many animal behaviorists who actually work in this area would disagree with me vehemently. And they, after all, have done the work. I'm just a paleontologist originally. But this is the idea that does the animal actually know what's going on inside the mind of the other animal? Of course, it observes. And there are some examples of the use of deceit and so forth. But it's far from clear that they really understand what it is to put yourselves into the shoes of, metaphorically speaking, of another animal. And this revolves around this so-called theory of mind, in other words. And I think the reason why I should be skeptical that animals show anything really close to what we associate with theory of mind, whereby we interpret, often very subtly, what other people are thinking. And hilariously, of course, sometimes get it completely around our neck. And this, of course, is the origin of irony and humor. Animals do not tell jokes. They can't. No more can an animal be an actor. No more can it put on the face paint. And I mentioned face paint. And of course, animals, by and large, do not get up in the morning humming or groaning, depending on whether they're happy or have got the most terrible hangover. And they look in the mirror and they say, what on earth is that? And of course, this underpins some very ingenious experiments which have been undertaken on a number of animals as to whether they can recognize themselves in mirrors, so-called mirror self-recognition. And indeed, a number of animals can. Most can't, or apparently cannot. It's always tricky. So what happens is you put a mark on the animal which is invisible to itself unless it's looking into a mirror. And so in some birds, some apes, some elephants, dolphins also, they look at the mirror and they realize that something's not quite right. But as I only fairly recently learned, these examples of mirror self-recognition are almost exclusively only observed in animals which are being brought up in human company, often more or less, well, I should not use the word pets, but basically, especially in the case of chimpanzees, more difficult if you're a dolphin, I grant you, but are effectively part of the family. They really do join in just about everything. The point is that these animals are what we refer to as enculturated. And enculturated animals are noticeably smarter than the animals in the wild. And this is not particularly surprising. But first of all, it gives me pause for thought for all these experiments which have been done in animals in captivity. And I've been into these sorts of places, and you notice that the scientists have spent all their time chatting to these animals. You know, how's Frank today? You know, and the animals love it. They get food and all the rest of it. But the point here is that mirror self-recognition is effectively only found in animals which are associated with humans. In the wild, they don't need to. Whereas we, of course, once you then talk about the metaphors of mirrors and the sheer strangeness of mirrors and Alice through the looking glass and all the rest of it, then mirrors actually are very strange indeed. So again, this is not to be destructive about what animals are. It again is to emphasize that in our company, they may be remarkably different. And one thinks about domesticated animals like dogs, which for many, many people are an essential part of their lives. It's a sort of symbiosis. It makes us richer, and we hope the dogs enjoy our company as well. But the aspects about this is that in terms of that enculturation, although there are many famous examples of animals doing sort of crude mathematics, you know, determining sort of the ordinality and things like that, and correspondingly using sign language, not only are these the result of truly intense training, but these are things which are basically on the basis of human prompting. We have no reason to think that animals per se will sit down one day and decide that it would be nice to know whether 2 + 2 is 5 or whatever. And fundamentally, these aspects about the distinction of ourselves and animals is to do with language. And again, the arguments of Darwinian continuity will point out, first of all, that the anatomical possession of my larynx, or the bird's syrinx, which acts in very much a convergent way to produce bird song, is something which provides that continuity between animal vocalizations and our language. But once again, when you begin to unpick this, it's far from clear this really can be the case. To begin with, in certain monkeys, the vervet monkeys are most famous, but there are other examples as well. Undoubtedly, they have calls which refer apparently to specific objects. And the classic example, which is always used to teach undergraduates, which is generally a graveyard of ambition, but let that pass, is that the vervet monkey will have a call for eagle and snake and leopard. And this is pretty important because these are dangerous animals. And by sending out the alarm, this alerts the other members of the troop that there's danger around. And sometimes this can be used in a distracting way. That's rather unusual. But the points are, first of all, that adoption of these so-called proto words is nothing like that at all, for a number of reasons. To begin with, they never export those meanings into other sort of contexts. More importantly, one can go to other groups of vervet monkeys away from the Locus classicus of this investigation site, and they have a very different systems of communication. In other groups of monkeys, it turns out, in fact, because the females are very good at vocalizing, they spend most of their time with the young. Whereas, unsurprisingly, at least from an English perspective, the male monkeys hardly say anything at all, just spend a bit of time grunting, whereas the female monkeys are chattering away and busy communicating to their young. So basically, there are sort of two languages there. Well, that's fine in terms of communicating locally, but if you're going to communicate as a species, it's a bit of a non-starter. And having said that, the example which at first sight seems to be so close to language comes not actually from the mammals, which are very vocal as a group, but to the birds, especially the songbirds, whereby they employ these remarkable sequences. And indeed, there are some striking analogies to our language, not least that when the young start to learn the language, they go through a so-called babbling phase, where they sort of begin to articulate the sounds before they crystallize into a fully formed fully formed song. And correspondingly, there are chunks of syntax, if you like, which can be moved around and so forth. And indeed, there are some striking analogies to our language. But as soon as you go slightly deeper, it turns out, in fact, that this is a very, very shallow comparison indeed. Partly because those songs are typically used in a sort of monoglot way. They're used to defend territories or attract mates and so forth. And also the language is never, also the song, I should say, is never exported into some other context, where, of course, the marvel of our language is that it is infinitely flexible and can be used, well, fascinatingly, of course, when you begin to translate things and you come across words which are almost untranslatable. And once you begin to use that word, you suddenly find new depths of understanding. And in a related way, of course, is this phenomenon known as recursion, whereby one can embed meaning within meaning within meaning within the sentence, and thereby one ends up with an almost infinitely rich set of possible explorations of understanding. And our language, if only we could step back from ourselves, which is so difficult to do, if we just looked around ourselves, and here I am at home because of lockdown and not in the university where I would much rather be working and all the rest, behind me, lots and lots of books, most of which I have read, I promise. But this ability to not only capture information, but to convey it in one way or another is something we do not see in animals. And some people might say, well, hang on a moment, do not animals have a sort of culture? Do they not have traditions? Do they not have different ways of breaking open stones and things like that? Well, true enough, but as somebody has pointed out, in point of fact, some groups may have culture, but they do not know that they have culture. And I think this is a actually genuinely profound observation. It goes more or less back to theory of mind and all the rest of it. And I mentioned very briefly this business about breaking open using stones, which indeed some chimpanzees do. And it's not quite full circle, because I must return to language in a moment, so I'm going slightly to one side at the moment. But animals do not teach. They learn they can demonstrate, but what they don't do is actually teach. So indeed, a female, typically female cat, whatever size, will teach its kittens or cubs or whatever how to hunt. But it's very clear from these and other observations, a very interesting one to do with meerkats in particular, that the tutor, which in these contexts is typically the female, whereas in the birdsong typically it's a male, as it so happens. Nothing hangs on this. It's very clear that the mother tutor, so to speak, does not understand what's actually going on inside the mind of its pupil. In other words, when we teach, we are able not only to convey vast amounts of information, at least I hope we do, but also by and large, even in a large lecture theatre, you can get a general idea whether the idea you're trying to get across is not working at all because you failed to articulate it, or whether indeed you can see, at least in some people, suddenly it clicks. Yes, I got it. That's the way it works. And the nearest thing to teaching in the animals is actually in some ants, as it so happens. So these aspects about the way that we deal with cause and effect, the way that we have analogical thinking, the way that we can think in categories. So if you think about a chimpanzee, we suspect that they may like apples. They demonstrate that. But they would have no concept of a cox or a pippin or a golden delicious. Well, no, I'd rather not have, never mind. Those sorts of things, that there are categories of fruit, and indeed one can subdivide them in all sorts of ways. It's part of course, of our culture might be. And the fact that they can certainly memorize, the fact they can certainly learn, but they don't actually, they're not in a position to actually convey information. With an enormous amount of effort, you can get to the rudiments of language through sign language, and an enormous amount of effort you can get to the rudiments of mathematics. And of course, the majority of people argue that although animals indeed have appreciation of relative numbers, this is something known as numerosity. By and large, there's no evidence at all that they would know how 2 + 2 works. And why this is also important, and although it need not be exported to a theistic framework, it invites us to think about the possibility that abstract things are abstract from our perspective, but they are completely real. They are genuine, they are there. And the example I like to use, because I'm absolutely hopeless at the area, is mathematics. And there's this famous essay by Jean Vigner about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and he uses a particular example. What is it, he asks, about a complex number? What is it about this entirely imaginary thing, which when exported into physics suddenly finds a deep traction where things actually work? What is it about our language, which in the end is never literal? It's always metaphorical. And even more essentially, if we really want to say something important, really important, absolutely essential, we stop speaking in words. Well, we stop speaking prose, we write poetry. Again, something I'm completely hopeless at. And with language also, and ultimately, I think, to consciousness itself, one is invited to think about the possibility that mind is something, and consciousness itself is something which a number of people are now insisting is absolutely waste of time to try and put this into a material context. Thomas Nagel has struggled with this, and he got a lot of flack for it. But I would certainly agree with those people who say consciousness is basically different. It's not the same thing at all. Now, to conclude, this is not then to say, well, arguments about the deity, arguments about God, arguments in favor of one religion or another are necessarily helped by my observations. But what I would like to persuade you, or at least to encourage you to wonder about, is whether the world around us is, well, deeply familiar, but in many other respects, very, very peculiar indeed. And from that perspective, I see why, just knowing that people are of all faith and no faith, so there's no proselytizing here, but one can say to be a theist and an evolutionary biologist is actually not a contradiction in terms, but in point of fact, I would turn the argument on its head and say, I really can't see how you could be an evolutionary biologist unless you're a theist. So I thank you for your Zoom attention, so to speak, and I believe that Hugh and others will, and Sarah will begin perhaps to deal with some questions, if that's okay, Hugh and Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, very much for a very, very interesting talk. And it's true, quite a number of questions have come in while you've been speaking, and we're going to try and organize these. So if you've asked questions, stay with us, please, and we'll try and get to your questions as we go along. Here's a very general question to start with that sort of looks at the whole approach that you've been taking. To what extent could we argue that the discontinuity that you describe between human and animal abilities is actually the result of our current inability to understand the animal world better?
Nice one, thank you. That's a very, very fair point, of course. One could extend that argument even further, in fact. Thomas Nagel, again, wrote a very, very famous essay about, I think, roughly, what is it like to have the mind of a bat? And as I recall his argument, he says, well, we'll never know. It is completely different, and not least because its sensory system depends principally on echolocation, which is also convergent, and all the rest of it. I think my response would be, first of all, that a number of people say we get too wound up about animal intelligences, in as much as the animals in question have their own intelligences and they are there for specifically what they need. And that's I think is very reasonable. Of course, one could think not only of modalities which would be very alien to us, like echolocation, which you see in whales as well as in bats. So yes, that's absolutely right. And added to that, of course, is the recurrent risk of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, whereby we find it incredibly difficult to see anything except through our eyes. But having said that, and all of that, I would still wish to argue that what we have in terms of our music and our literature and our poetry, in our science and all the rest of it, is something which is astonishing. And it's, again, in a certain way, when I was using the example of the Rhesus Monkeys and the metronome, we are the peculiar ones. That we are the outliers here. We're the ones who understand ourselves, ironically. But it's the fact, apparently, and again, to keep on insisting, in no sense am I saying that because the animal can't do calculus, well, by the way, neither can I, at least not with a lot of help, actually is quantitatively different. And again, Darwin was nervous about this in his correspondence in particular. He sort of say, how do I know what's going on inside the mind of the dog beside me? How can I trust my own thoughts? And not being a philosopher, Darwin didn't want to explore that because it leads into some pretty dangerous territory. And he would say the difference between animals and ourselves is one of degree, not kind. Whereas I think, in a sense, which would go back to Thomas Aquinas, and again, I'm not a Thomist, but he would regard ourselves as possessing not only the souls we find in all life, vegetative, in animals, the animal soul, but also we have the intellectual soul. Now, you have to be a theologian, you have to begin to subscribe to a particular world picture, which will certainly not resonate with many people. But to me, that actually makes a lot of sense. But I'm adopting a metaphysics, which I think will take me further.
Okay, thank you. Look, here's another question that's slightly related. Could you comment on our capacity as humans for evil? And would you say that we are uniquely destructive within the animal kingdom?
Well, we've got another 3 hours to answer this question. Thank you, Hugh. Okay, that's right, jolly good. Thank you, everybody. I see the numbers of viewing have fallen from 150 to 2. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous question. I would say that, we go very quickly into theological ground, which I have no intention of doing at all. Not because I'm not interested in it, but I think it will take us too far afield. But to begin with, many of the people who work, especially on the chimpanzees and the great apes, will identify the features in these animals which seem to resonate very much with us. The chimpanzees hunt, or the male chimpanzee. Well, actually, they don't hunt in the way we do. They don't have a war. They don't have a war room. these chimpanzees can show spite and revenge and all the rest of it. Well, in point of fact, there's really no evidence that they do. I mean, they can be violent beyond dispute, but there's no evidence that they show the sorts of things which we would associate with bad behavior on our part. They can defend, chimpanzees can engage in what is called warfare and all the rest of it. But again, if one subscribes to the theory of mind and all the rest of it, I don't think what's going on in their heads and the aggression you undoubtedly see in many animals, mostly to co-specifics, not beyond that, is not the same as what we see. So what's going on here? Well, in essence, theodicy, that is the question of evil. What is it? Why is the world so bad? You know, COVID, for instance, is just a stupid tiny virus, but for goodness sake, look what it's done. Lives in a bat, comes to us, and gracious me, the world's in chaos. Well, I don't think it's quite as bad as that. I think we ourselves, our cultures have changed with regard to the degrees of risk, but I won't go off in that direction either. It's a nasty disease, and I don't recommend anybody getting it. My son would tell you that, and he works in a hospital. But the point about the theodicy is it is the great stumbling block for anybody who wishes to subscribe to a beneficent God, undoubtedly. It is the catastrophe of people's lives. And I cannot offer any sort of explanation which is worth subscribing to, other than if we have a metaphysics where, in a sense, although we can be agents for evil, evil itself, and I do not mean this in what is referred to as the Manichaean way of equal forces balancing between good and evil, but if one says there are forces, for want of a better word, which can infest you, and one can think of countries which just have slid into utter disaster, and you look at these places and think, what on earth was going on here? And none of us are immune to this. I'm not for a moment pointing fingers at one person or another. But I think that's part of the intellectual soul of Aquinas. That's part of how we make contact with things which may be extraordinarily beautiful, but sometimes can be extraordinarily risky. And this is such a minefield to talk about. But in that sense, animals are innocent and we are not.
Okay, look, in the light of what you've just said, there was a question that came in very early on during your talk, which reflects a similar sort of concern. The questioner says that they struggle with the brutality of nature, the very sort of essence of Darwinian thinking, and how should God set up a system like this in which creatures survive at the expense of each other, involving suffering and killing. Now, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but it would be helpful for you just to say a bit about it for us now.
Well, again, I'm sorry, I have no answer. No, I must be very careful what I say, because these days, there are so many sensitivities around. I think the point is, as has been often argued, that for better or worse, although for all intents and purposes, and you may quote me here, but no, don't bother. We might as well have been parachuted on this planet because I've emphasized the differences between ourselves and animals. But of course we haven't. We are a product of evolution. And we are, or at least our ancestors, presumably contributed to this general carnage going back for hundreds of millions of years. And C.S. Lewis talks about this issue as well. And again, in the same way with theodicy, I don't have an explanation other than, and I know people in the Faraday have thought a lot more about this in terms of natural disasters and so forth. And it's an easy answer, and it sounds flippant, but it's not clear to me the world can work in any other sort of way. So the point is that by and large, when I mentioned those New Caledonian crows extracting the beetle grubs, the reason they do that is because those beetle grubs, which indeed are actually a food source for various other people, and insect foods become more and more popular, of course, is they're very nutritious. They're full of fat and proteins, which they need for the brains for them to develop. But I cannot see how the world's going to work unless it has such matters as predator and prey, such matters as plate tectonics and earthquakes. The differences would be, though, that we know about this as humans, and we can do something, not very much, we can do some things to ameliorate this, if we possibly can. The second thing, and this is a specifically Christian argument, although I think the Jews would also, I believe, subscribe to, and very possibly Islam as well. I simply don't have the necessary breadth of knowledge. But all the time, we are dealing with unfinished business. You know, this is things are bad, and just at the moment, as I just mentioned, things could be a great deal better. Thank you very much indeed. But the story is not completed. And I think in a way, when I mentioned in passing the question of hominin evolution, all these species are all extinct. Neanderthals are gone as well. We could have had some interesting things to say about them, because I have about 4% Neanderthal DNA, and there's another story there. The point about this is that even today, there are people you occasionally meet who you just are staggered in terms of their wisdom and their ability to talk about things and to encompass people and bring them in and all the rest of it. Whereas people like myself are really just pretty selfish and spend a lot of time just wandering around, not being terribly helpful, frankly. So none of this is an explanation of what happened in the past. But I think what's really important, again, from a theistic viewpoint, is to insist that we are dealing with unfinished business. And St. Paul in particular is very famous in this particular regard, in that way. But because we are part of creation, because we are embedded in that creation, because, of course, in the famous Genesis narrative, we're invited to name the plants and animals, more or less. Again, this has a lot of sort of negative publicity now, but I think, again, you can take a much more generous view of this. So I don't answer that very fair question, and Hugh, you're absolutely right. It's a question we're all asked repeatedly, but it's the wish to adopt a wider framework, to take, you know, not to be unnecessarily focused on things which we do not fully understand.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to some of your comments on animal behavior. And the questioner says, when we see animals apparently enjoying themselves, either on their own or in groups, doesn't this indicate that they're exploring something beyond themselves and beyond what they need simply for survival?
I think that's right. Yeah, I would. Animals certainly play. Curiously enough, it's something which is pretty well universal in mammals. There are one or two exceptions, perhaps. It's much rarer in birds, it so happens, and typically it's only found in the brighter of the birds. The most famous example is actually the parrot known as a kea from New Zealand. I'm sure that's correct, but I did mention in passing, and only a dog, which, you know, has advantages and disadvantages. I needn't go into either. You know, they clearly have emotions, and there's no reason why they should not enjoy themselves. And when I see our jackdaws, which are nesting up in the roof, and the crows on the common, fooling around and all the rest of it, of course, I don't know whether they're actually fooling around and so forth, but you get the sense when they're tumbling through the sky, this is sort of aerobatics, which is, you know, surplus to requirements. So I'm not saying they can't enjoy themselves, but on the other hand, you know, I look at the birds and they come to the feeding table and all the rest of it. And then, of course, we sneak upstairs and we sleep as well as we can in the present circumstances. But I'm not really want to spend, you know, the whole night under a bush with the potential of being swallowed by a snake. So it's not to say that, you know, their times of pleasure, I'm sure, are as intense as ours. But overall, being an animal is not a lot of fun. You know? They're constantly hungry. They're constantly looking for mates. They're constantly guarding territories. And thank goodness we do those sorts of things. But by and large, we try and do it in a couth way, because we can see into the minds of our friends and even our enemies.
Okay, thank you. Slightly different direction now. We use the word theism in the title of your talk, and you've used it in the talk. Maybe you could just enlighten us a little bit more about exactly what you mean by theism in the context in which you're talking about. Are you just suggesting the ascent to a higher power, a higher intelligence, or a higher purpose? Or are you making any claims about what the nature of that higher power is?
Oh, thank you. I can make lots of claims, of course. They may not appeal to everybody, you know, what's actually going on. With regard to the term theism. Let me say to begin with that I'm nervous about using words such as intelligence, a higher intelligence, those sorts of things, because we always struggle to imagine the higher purpose or whatever you want to define it as, to be theistic, in other words, from a human perspective. And this is a common complaint amongst theologians, whereas first of all, I certainly believe in God, as I mentioned in passing right at the beginning. I'm a Christian, so if anybody else is a Christian here, then I would subscribe very much to what G.K. Chesterton calls orthodoxy, to do with matters of the incarnation and the resurrection or resurrection. But that is something which will not be shared almost certainly by the majority of people who are taking time to listen to this. So there's a whole set of contexts there, which I would be perfectly happy to talk about, but they would not necessarily be of much help to many other people. So with regard to theism itself, all it is, as I think in a sense your questioner hinted, and maybe through your voice, Hugh, is that yes, indeed, there is an other there, which ultimately we are responsible to. Ultimately, we are answerable to that person, because ultimately we are not robots, but we are part of a creation, and we are answerable first of all to that creation and its good care, but also, and this is a different story, and if I was to move my screen here, you'd see far too many books about the Inklings and so forth, but also that we can engage in subcreation in the way which J.R.R. Tolkien explored so extraordinarily. So it's not really an answer, and it's a rambling response to what is the question of theism. But it is, in a sense, at its most elementary, to say that if you wish to remain a materialist, that is, that it is a matter simply of what is here in front of you and is observable, then I think you won't get much traction on the various things which I've been trying to explore in their various ways, these abstract potentialities. Whether that translates into a personal God or
Oops, we seem to have lost you for a moment, Simon. Your screen is frozen. So we'll just give it a moment and hope that your internet connection comes back. Okay, meanwhile, those of you who are viewing on Zoom or on YouTube, let me just remind you of a forthcoming talk which will happen later today. Let me just remind you of a forthcoming talk which will happen later today at 2 o'clock British Summer Time. Our next talk in this series is one on evolutionary anthropology. So it's going to pick up some of the themes that Simon ConwayMorris has been developing in his talk this morning. The title is, Does Evolutionary Anthropology Show That Humans Are Distinctive? And it'll be by Dr. Cara WallScheffler, coming to us from the East Coast of the United States. And so that will follow. Simon, I'm sorry we lost you for a moment or two.
I apologize.
You've rejoined us. I'm sure it was not of your doing.
Probably was, actually.
Some strange internet provider got in the way between us.
I'm sorry.
But that's fine. Let me just finish with one final question, which came in earlier, which I'm just going to pull up on my screen. You were talking to us when you so unfortunately got disconnected from us about theism. But this question is in a way a bit more personal, and it's about your relationship with the Christian faith. Is this something that you came to independent of your science or through your science, or have the two been sort of parallel tracks within your life for a long time?
Well, thank you. I'm first of all, being English, I'm extremely reluctant to talk about myself, and I shall begin to mumble. Very briefly, in a sense, they're parallel tracks, but the sort of science I've been working on and off, begin with on the Burgess Shale, provoked me to think a bit about convergent evolution, and that in turn provoked me to think about, whether there's a deeper structure to biology. And of course, the idea there's a deeper structure to things would be something which would resonate with a physicist or a chemist. But on the other hand, as mentioned very briefly, unless it was cut out, specifically with Christianity, as C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and others have pointed out, it makes some extraordinarily specific claims, which may not appeal to everybody. And again, I'm not here to proselytize in that particular regard, but it's really having been invited into the metaphysical world, especially the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, Charles Williams, Barfield in particular. I mentioned language, but I didn't have time to talk about Owen Barfield and the rest, is that every time I read these sorts of works, they are so sensible, so rich, and so inviting for further exploration. And all of them, they didn't, Barfield actually in some senses was a little left field to the others with regard to his faith, but each one of them sort of had a sense, an articulacy of faith. And it's not trying to ride two horses at the same time. It's suddenly to find, if you think back to that wonderful piece in Lewis's Great Divorce in particular, where suddenly you find the horse you're on was the horse you were riding all the time, but you never recognized it.
Thank you very much indeed. Simon, you've given us a great talk. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sticking with us and allowing us to ask you all these different questions. Thank you too to the questioners and the other viewers who've participated. We're very grateful for your participation in this series of webinars.